Sometimes a man's heart knows things his mind cannot explain. For Eli Rourke, that knowing had been pulling at him for months, drawing him towards something he couldn't name. The folks in Dry Ridge thought he'd lost his mind when he spent his last $50 on a flooded cabin. They laughed as the bearded mountain man waded through knee-deep water with his dog Jasper watching from dry ground. What they saw was a fool buying a ruin. What Eli saw was an answer to dreams that had haunted his sleep. Inside the cabin, muddy water swirled around broken furniture and floating papers. Eli picked up a water-stained document, wiping away the grime. His hands trembled. The signature at the bottom belonged to his father, a man who supposedly drowned 30 years ago. What had Thomas Rourke hidden in this cabin before the great flood claimed him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eli Rourke had lived 37 years carrying the weight of his father's memory like a stone in his chest. Every morning, as he watched the sun climb over the jagged peaks of the Montana wilderness, he touched the hand-carved wooden cross that hung around his neck, the last thing Thomas Rourke had pressed into his 7-year-old son's palm before walking into that terrible storm. "Keep this close, boy," his father had said, his weathered hands trembling as he fastened the leather cord around Eli's small neck. "When you're lost, it'll help you find your way home." The next morning, they found Thomas's hat floating in Willow Creek, swollen with spring runoff and debris from the Great Flood of 1845. They never found the body. The town preacher said God had called Thomas home, but 7-year-old Eli knew better. His father wouldn't have left him, not willingly. Now 3 decades later, Eli lived alone in a cabin he'd built with his own hands, high in the mountain passes where the air was thin and the silence thick as honey. Jasper, a grizzled border collie with one clouded eye and a limp from an old encounter with a mountain cat, was his only constant companion. The dog had wandered into Eli's life 5 years ago, half-starved and suspicious of human kindness, but they'd found something in each other that neither could name. Most folks in Dry Ridge considered Eli an oddity, a mountain hermit who came to town once a month for supplies, spoke only when spoken to, and paid his debts in cash or trade. They respected him certainly. He was honest as sunrise, never took more than he needed, and had pulled more than one lost hunter out of the wilderness over the years. But they didn't understand him. How could a man be content with so much solitude? What was he hiding from up there in the peaks? The truth was simpler and more complicated than they imagined. Eli wasn't hiding from anything. He was listening for something. In the whisper of wind through pine needles, in the conversations of ravens at dawn, in the way morning mist clung to valley floors, he heard echoes of his father's voice. Not words exactly, but something deeper. A presence that had never truly left. The dreams had started 6 months ago. Always the same sequence, standing in murky water that reached his knees, looking at a cabin with moss-covered walls and windows dark as secrets. In the dreams, someone was calling his name, but when he turned to look, he saw only ripples spreading across the water's surface. He would wake with his heart hammering and the wooden cross warm against his chest, as if it had been touched by invisible hands. Martha Hendricks, at the general store, had been the one to mention the cabin for sale. She was one of the few people in Dry Ridge who remembered Thomas Rourke with genuine fondness. And she'd watched Eli grow from a silent boy into a man of few words but deep convictions. "That old flood cabin's finally going up for auction," she'd said while wrapping his monthly provisions in brown paper. "Been sitting empty since the waters receded. Nobody wants it. Too much water damage, they say. But it's got good bones." Eli had felt something stir in his chest at her words. "Where is it?" "Down past Miller's Bend, where the creek makes that big curve. You know the spot, where your daddy used to take you fishing when you were small." That night, Eli had ridden down to look at the place. Even in moonlight, he recognized it from his dreams. The cabin sat in a natural depression, where Willow Creek had carved out a small flood plain. Water still pooled around its foundation, but it wasn't the dark, threatening water of his nightmares. In the pale light, it looked almost peaceful, like a tired old man resting in a shallow bath. Jasper had whined softly and pressed against Eli's leg, sensing something his master couldn't yet name. But Eli had felt it too, a pull, gentle but insistent, drawing him toward the weathered door that hung slightly ajar. The auction had been a formality. Nobody else bid on what the auctioneer called a pile of soggy timber and broken dreams. $50 took the deed, and with it came 2 acres of flood-prone land that most sensible people would have avoided. But as Eli signed the papers, he felt something settle in his chest for the first time in years. Not peace, exactly, but purpose. Old Pete McCready, who ran the feed store, had shaken his head as they walked away from the courthouse. "Don't know what you're thinking, Eli. That place has been nothing but trouble since the flood. Ground's too wet for farming, too unreliable for building. What you gonna do with it?" Eli had touched the wooden cross beneath his shirt and looked toward the mountains where his real home waited. "Don't rightly know yet, Pete, but I reckon it'll tell me when I get there." The townspeople had their theories, of course. Some thought he planned to salvage whatever lumber was still good. Others figured he wanted the land for grazing, though any fool could see it was too marshy for cattle. A few of the more charitable souls suggested he was simply being sentimental, buying a piece of his father's memory, even if it came water-damaged and half-ruined. None of them guessed the truth, that Eli Rourke was following something deeper than sentiment or practical purpose. He was following the same instinct that had guided his father through 30 years of surveying and exploring these mountains, the same sense that had made Thomas Rourke the kind of man people trusted with their deepest secrets and most difficult problems. In the weeks between buying the cabin and actually wading into its flooded interior, Eli had found himself drawn to stories about his father that he'd never heard before. Martha Hendricks proved to be a treasure trove of memories, and during his monthly visits to town, she'd taken to sharing them over coffee and fresh-baked bread. "Your daddy was the most curious man I ever knew," she'd said, her eyes growing distant with remembrance, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. He could look at a piece of land and tell you things about it that nobody else would notice, where the water ran underground, which way the wind would blow come winter, where you'd want to build if you were smart. She'd pause then, her flour-dusted hands still for a moment. "He was working on something important before he died, Eli. Some kind of project that had him excited in a way I'd never seen. Said it was going to change everything for folks around here, make the hard times easier to bear." But when Eli pressed for details, Martha's memory grew fuzzy. Thomas had been secretive about his work those last few months, spending long hours away from home and returning with mud on his boots and satisfaction in his eyes. He'd spoken of dreams and plans, of leaving something worthwhile for his son, but he'd never explained exactly what that something might be. Now, standing in the flooded cabin with his father's signature fresh in his memory, Eli understood that the dreams hadn't been calling him toward answers. They'd been calling him toward questions, the right questions, the ones that might finally unlock the mystery of Thomas Rourke's last days and the legacy he'd tried so desperately to preserve. Jasper stood at the cabin's threshold, unwilling to step into the standing water, but alert to every sound and movement. His master's tension had communicated itself through the leash and into the dog's watchful stillness. Whatever lay hidden in this place, it was important enough to disturb the careful peace they'd built in their mountain sanctuary. Eli folded the water-stained document carefully and slipped it inside his coat pocket, next to his heart where the wooden cross rested. Tomorrow he would begin the careful work of excavation, not just of the cabin's waterlogged contents, but of the truth his father had died trying to protect. For tonight, though, he stood in the doorway and listened to the gentle lap of water against weathered wood, feeling more connected to Thomas Rourke than he had since that terrible morning 30 years ago when the world had changed forever. The dreams had brought him here for a reason, and that reason was only beginning to reveal itself. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Eli loaded his saddlebags with rope, lanterns, and waterproof canvas, then rode down to the cabin with Jasper trotting alongside. The document from yesterday weighed heavy in his coat pocket, but he forced himself to approach the investigation methodically. His father had been a careful man, and if Thomas had left clues, they would be preserved with intention. The standing water inside the cabin was deeper than it had appeared in yesterday's fading light, nearly waist-deep in some places where the floor had sagged. Eli waded in slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the moss-covered roof, creating golden shafts that illuminated floating debris like artifacts in a museum. Most of the cabin's contents had been destroyed by years of submersion, but certain items had survived. Metal objects mostly, pots and tools and hardware that had settled to the bottom and stayed there. Eli worked systematically, feeling along the submerged floor with his boots, occasionally reaching down to retrieve something that seemed promising. It was near the back corner, in what had once been a sleeping area, that his foot struck something substantial. He took a deep breath and dove beneath the surface, his hands finding a wooden chest bound with iron straps. The lock had long since rusted away, but the chest itself was solid oak, built to last. With considerable effort, he managed to drag it to shallower water near the door. Inside the chest, wrapped in oiled leather that had kept most of the water out, Eli found his father's surveying equipment. A brass compass caught the morning light, its face still clear, despite 3 decades underwater. When he lifted it from its leather case, he saw T. Rourke, engraved in careful script along the rim, his father's proud signature on the tool of his trade. But this was no ordinary compass. As Eli examined it more closely, he noticed that the needle didn't point true north. Instead, it swung consistently toward the northeast, as if drawn by some magnetic anomaly. He turned the compass in his hands, watching the needle maintain its stubborn direction, regardless of how he oriented the instrument. "What were you looking for, old man?" Eli murmured, his voice echoing softly in the confined space. Beneath the compass he found rolled maps and surveying notes, most too water-damaged to read clearly. But one set of papers had been wrapped in additional layers of oiled cloth, and these had survived almost intact. Eli spread them carefully on a dry section of the cabin's raised hearth, weighing down the corners with stones. What he saw made his breath catch. These weren't standard surveying maps of the area around Dry Ridge. These were detailed studies of water flow, underground streams, seasonal runoff patterns, and what appeared to be a comprehensive analysis of the entire watershed that fed the valley. His father had documented every spring, every seasonal creek, every place where water emerged from or disappeared into the rocky ground. More intriguing still were the notations in Thomas's careful handwriting, measurements, calculations, and observations that suggested he'd been tracking water usage across multiple properties over several years. Some of the notes were cryptic: Blackwood diversion, illegal, and missing flow at Henderson Spring, check upstream diversions. The name Blackwood sent a chill through Eli's memory. The Blackwood family had been the largest landowners in the valley for as long as anyone could remember, their spread encompassing nearly 1/3 of the usable grazing land. Old Samuel Blackwood had died just a few years after Thomas, but his sons had inherited both his land and his reputation for getting what they wanted. Regardless of how their neighbors fared, Eli was so absorbed in studying the maps that he didn't hear the footsteps splashing through the standing water outside. It was Jasper's low growl that alerted him to the visitor. He looked up to see a woman silhouetted in the doorway, her grey hair caught in a neat bun, and her practical dress hiked up to keep it dry. "Martha," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you out here." Martha Hendricks stepped carefully into the cabin, her eyes taking in the scattered papers and surveying equipment. "Figured you might need some help making sense of whatever you found. I brought coffee and sandwiches. Thought you might be here a while." She handed him a wrapped bundle and a tin cup that smelled of strong coffee, then settled herself on a relatively dry section of the hearth. Her presence was comforting in a way that Eli hadn't realized he needed. The cabin felt less haunted, with another living soul sharing its shadows. "Find anything interesting?" she asked, nodding toward the maps. Eli showed her the compass first, watching her eyes widen as she recognized the engraving. "I remember that," she said softly. "Your father was so proud when it came in from Denver, said it was the finest instrument he'd ever owned." "It's not working right," Eli said, demonstrating how the needle pulled consistently northeast. "Either something's wrong with it or your father modified it somehow," Martha finished. She'd known Thomas well enough to recognize his methodical nature. He was always tinkering with his equipment, trying to make it more accurate or more useful. "What else did you find?" Eli spread out the water flow maps, pointing to the various notations and measurements. Martha studied them with the kind of focused attention that came from decades of helping her late husband with his own land management decisions. "These are water rights documentation," she said after a long moment. "Look here, he's tracking how much water each property is using versus how much they're entitled to under territorial law." She pointed to a series of calculations that showed significant discrepancies. According to Thomas's measurements, several large properties were using far more water than their legal allocations, while smaller farms downstream were experiencing mysterious shortages. "The Blackwood Ranch shows the biggest discrepancy," Eli observed, tracing his finger along a red line that marked their property boundary. "According to this, they were taking nearly twice their legal share." Martha nodded grimly. "I remember that summer, 1845, the year your father died. It was dry, drier than usual, and a lot of the smaller farmers lost their crops. There was talk of illegal diversions, but nobody could prove anything. The Blackwoods claimed they weren't taking any more than they'd always taken. But father was gathering proof," Eli said, understanding beginning to dawn. "He was building a case against them." "More than that," Martha said, pointing to a section of the map that showed detailed engineering drawings. "Look at these irrigation plans. Your father wasn't just documenting water theft, he was designing a solution. The drawings showed an intricate system of channels, reservoirs, and distribution points that would have allowed the entire valley to share water resources more efficiently. It was ambitious engineering, the kind of project that would have required significant community cooperation and substantial investment. This would have changed everything," Eli breathed. "Small farmers would have had reliable water even in dry years, and the Blackwoods would have lost their advantage," Martha added. "No more hoarding water while their neighbors struggled. No more buying up failed farms at rock-bottom prices when drought destroyed the crops." They sat in contemplative silence for a moment, listening to the gentle splash of water against the cabin walls. Finally, Eli voiced the question that had been growing in his mind since yesterday. "Martha, what if my father didn't drown accidentally? What if someone killed him to stop this project?" Martha's face went pale, but she didn't seem surprised by the suggestion. "I've wondered about that myself over the years," she admitted. "Thomas was a strong swimmer, and he knew these mountains better than anyone. It never made sense to me that he'd get caught in floodwater no matter how bad the storm was." Eli picked up the compass again, watching its steady pull toward the northeast. "This isn't broken," he said with sudden certainty. Father modified it to point toward something specific. "Something he wanted me to find. What makes you think it was meant for you?" Eli touched the wooden cross beneath his shirt. "The dreams, Martha. I've been dreaming about this place for months. Something led me here. And now I'm holding Father's compass, and it's pointing me toward whatever he died trying to protect." Martha reached over and squeezed his hand. "Then I reckon you'd better follow where it leads." "But Eli, if your father was murdered for what he knew, then whoever did it might still be alive. Might still be dangerous." Eli nodded, understanding the warning but feeling no inclination to heed it. For 30 years, he'd lived with the hollow ache of unfinished business, the sense that his father's story had been cut short before its proper ending. Now finally he had a thread to follow. "I need to see what's northeast of here," he said, standing and gathering the maps. "And I need to understand what Father was really working on in those final months." As they prepared to leave the cabin, Eli took one last look around the flooded interior. Yesterday, this place had seemed like nothing more than a ruin. Today, it felt like the beginning of something, a doorway, opening onto truths that had been locked away for 3 decades. The compass needle swung steadily in his palm, pointing toward answers that might finally allow both him and his father's spirit to rest. But first, Eli would have to discover whether some truths were worth killing for, and whether they were worth dying for as well. That evening, Eli sat by lamplight in his mountain cabin, carefully turning the pages of his father's leather-bound journal. The volume had been wrapped in multiple layers of oiled cloth at the bottom of the surveying chest, and while some pages showed water damage around the edges, most of Thomas's meticulous handwriting remained legible. What emerged from those pages was a portrait of a man driven by growing concern for his community's future. The journal entries began in spring of 1844, more than a year before Thomas's death, and documented a systematic investigation that had consumed his final months of life. May 15, 1844. Henderson Farm reports severe water shortage despite normal snowpack. Spring flow down by half from previous year. Need to check upstream for diversions. May 22, 1844, found evidence of new channel dug from Main Creek toward Blackwood property. Channel appears designed to capture water before it reaches Henderson Spring. No territorial permit on file. June 3, 1844. Measured flow rates at 6 points along Willow Creek. Calculations show approximately 40% of natural flow being diverted before reaching established downstream rights. This explains crop failures on Miller, Henderson, and Kowalski properties. Entry by entry, Thomas had built a damning case against the Blackwood family's water practices. But what struck Eli most powerfully was the evolution in his father's thinking as the investigation progressed. Early entries focused on documenting the problem, but by autumn, Thomas was designing solutions. October 12, 1844, spoke with territorial engineer about irrigation possibilities. Says the natural gradient in our valley could support gravity-fed distribution system if properly designed. Could provide reliable water to all properties, even in dry years. October 28, 1844, spent days surveying potential reservoir sites. Natural depression near Widow's Peak could hold sufficient water for entire valley. Would require community cooperation and significant investment, but benefits would justify cost. Jasper lay curled near the fireplace, occasionally lifting his head when coyotes called from the distant ridges. The dog seemed to sense his master's tension, the way Eli's breathing changed as he read certain passages, the way his hand would unconsciously reach for the wooden cross when the journal entries grew particularly troubling. November 15th, 1844, confronted Samuel Blackwood about illegal diversions. He claims grandfather rights supersede territorial law. Threatened legal action if I pursue matter further. Told him I'm documenting everything for territorial authorities. December 2nd, 1844, Blackwood men visited Henderson Farm. Offered to buy property at quarter of assessed value. When Henderson refused, they mentioned that water problems might get worse before they get better. Clear intimidation. December 20th, 1844. Meeting with affected farmers tonight. Time to present evidence and propose solution. If we stand together, we can break Blackwood monopoly on water rights and build something that serves everyone. Eli turned the page, expecting to find details about that crucial meeting. But the next entry was dated 3 weeks later, and Thomas's normally steady handwriting showed signs of stress. January 10th, 1845. Someone broke into cabin while I was away. Surveying equipment undisturbed, but papers scattered. Nothing obviously missing, but clear message sent. They're watching. January 18th, 1845. Strange men asking questions in town about my activities. Martha says they claim to be territorial officials, but their questions seemed more personal than official. Need to be more careful about where I keep important documents. February 3rd, 1845. Moved all critical papers to secure location. If something happens to me, Eli will need to know the truth. The irrigation plans are complete. Community could implement them with proper cooperation. Water rights evidence documented and witnessed. Justice will come, one way or another. The final entry was dated just 2 days before the storm that supposedly claimed Thomas's life. February 14th, 1845. They think they've won, but they underestimate the power of truth. What I've discovered will outlive any of us. My boy is young now, but someday he'll be old enough to understand. When that day comes, I pray he'll have the strength to finish what I started. The compass will guide him when he's ready. Eli closed the journal carefully, his hands trembling slightly. The methodical documentation of his father's final months painted a picture of a man who knew he was in danger but refused to abandon his principles. Thomas had been gathering evidence, building alliances, and preparing for a confrontation that he suspected might cost him his life. Outside, the wind picked up, sending pine needles skittering across the cabin's roof. Eli rose and added another log to the fire, then moved to the window that looked out over the valley, where dry ridges scattered lights twinkled like fallen stars. Somewhere down there, the descendants of the men who had killed his father were probably sleeping peacefully, confident that their family's crimes had been buried with Thomas Rourke, but secrets had a way of surfacing, especially when someone cared enough to dig for them. And now Eli had both the evidence and the motivation to excavate 30 years of buried truth. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with the smell of snow in the air. Eli packed the journal, compass, and maps into his saddlebags, then rode down to Dry Ridge, with Jasper trotting alongside. His first stop was Martha's general store, where he found her arranging bolts of fabric on the display table. "You look like a man who didn't get much sleep," she observed, noting the shadows under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. "Read through Father's journal last night," Eli replied, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "Martha, he knew they were going to kill him. The last entry talks about moving papers to a secure location and leaving evidence for me to find someday." Martha's face grew solemn. "What kind of evidence?" Eli showed her the compass, watching as she examined the modified needle. "He says this will guide me when I'm ready. I think there's more hidden somewhere. Maybe the complete irrigation plans or legal documentation that proves the Blackwood family's guilt. Where do you think he hid it?" "The compass points northeast consistently. There's something in that direction that Father wanted me to find." Martha considered this, her merchant's mind working through possibilities. "Northeast from the cabin would take you toward Miller's Creek, then up into the high country beyond Widow's Peak. Lot of caves and rock formations up there, good places to hide things. I need to follow the compass," Eli said. "But first, I want to talk to some of the older folks in town, people who were here in 1845, who might remember what really happened during those final weeks." Martha nodded thoughtfully. "Old Pete McCready was here then, though he was just a young man working his father's place. And Sarah Miller, she's Henderson's daughter, married name changed, but she'd remember the water troubles. Both of them are getting on in years, but their memories are still sharp. Anyone else?" "Doc Brennan treated folks during the cholera outbreak that same winter. He might remember details about the time around your father's death. And there's Jim Kowalski. He was just a boy then, but his family's farm was one of the ones affected by the water shortage." Eli finished his coffee and stood to leave. "I'll start with Pete and work my way through the list. If Father was building a case against the Blackwoods, some of these people might have been witnesses or allies." "Be careful," Martha warned. "If the Blackwood family killed once to protect their secrets, they might be willing to do it again. Their sons run the ranch now, and they've got the same ruthless streak as their father." Eli touched the wooden cross beneath his shirt, feeling its familiar weight against his chest. "I appreciate the warning, Martha, but I've spent 30 years wondering what really happened to my father. I'm not going to stop now just because the truth might be dangerous." As he rode toward Pete McCready's place, Eli reflected on how much his life had changed in just 2 days. Before finding that water-stained document, he'd been content with his solitary existence, accepting his father's death as a tragic accident and finding peace in the mountain wilderness. Now he felt the pull of unfinished business, the weight of inherited responsibility, The compass rested in his coat pocket, its modified needle a constant reminder that Thomas Rourke had planned for this moment. Somewhere in the mountains northeast of Dry Ridge, answers waited in whatever secure location his father had chosen. But first, Eli needed to understand the full scope of what Thomas had discovered, and why that knowledge had been worth dying to protect. Pete McCready's weathered hands shook slightly as he examined the detailed irrigation plans that Eli had spread across his kitchen table. At 73, Pete was one of the few men in Dry Ridge who remembered the water troubles of 1845 with adult clarity, and the recognition in his eyes confirmed what Eli had hoped to hear. "Sweet mercy," Pete breathed, tracing his finger along the carefully drawn channels and distribution points. "Your father showed me these plans the week before he died. Said they could change everything for the small farmers in the valley." Eli leaned forward in his chair, Jasper resting quietly at his feet. "What exactly did he tell you, Pete?" The old man's eyes grew distant with memory. "Thomas came by on a Sunday evening. I remember because my Sarah was making her special pot roast, and we invited him to stay for supper. He was excited about something, more animated than I'd seen him in months. He spread these same papers out right here on this table and explained how the whole system would work." Pete pointed to various sections of the plans as he spoke. "See this reservoir up near Widow's Peak? Thomas had calculated that it could hold enough water to supply the entire valley through even the driest summers. The beauty of the design was that it worked with gravity, no need for expensive pumping equipment that most folks couldn't afford." "What did the other farmers think of the idea?" "Most were enthusiastic," Pete replied. "We'd all been struggling with water shortages, watching our crops fail while the blackwood spread stayed green as spring grass. Thomas explained how we could pool our resources, work together to build something that would benefit everyone." Pete's expression darkened. But there were obstacles. The reservoir site was on land that Samuel Blackwood claimed, even though the territorial survey showed it as unclaimed federal land. And some of the channel routes would have to cross Blackwood property, which meant we'd need his cooperation or legal right-of-way. Did Father think Blackwood would cooperate? Pete snorted. Thomas was an optimist, but he wasn't a fool. He knew the Blackwoods would fight any system that ended their water monopoly. That's why he was gathering legal evidence, to force them to comply with territorial water law. Eli pulled out his father's journal and showed Pete several key entries. The old man read slowly, his lips moving slightly with the words, and his face grew increasingly troubled. "I remember some of this," Pete said finally. The intimidation visits, the mysterious strangers asking questions. There was a feeling in the air that winter, like a storm building on the horizon, but you couldn't quite see it yet. "Pete, do you think my father was murdered?" The question hung in the air between them for a long moment. Finally, Pete set down the journal and met Eli's eyes directly. "I've wondered about that for 30 years, he admitted. "Thomas was the strongest swimmer in the county, and he knew these mountains like the back of his hand. The idea that he'd get caught in floodwater never sat right with me. But what could any of us prove? The Blackwoods were powerful, and we were just small farmers trying to scratch out a living. What about the night he died? Do you remember anything specific about that storm?" Pete nodded slowly. "It was February 16th, a date I'll never forget because it changed everything for all of us. The storm came up sudden, but it wasn't the worst we'd seen that winter. Thomas had been through worse weather many times. But that morning, when they found his hat in the creek, Samuel Blackwood was one of the first to arrive at the search. That seems natural enough, neighbor helping in a crisis." "Maybe," Pete said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "Except that Blackwood seemed more interested in whether they'd found any of Thomas's surveying equipment than in finding Thomas himself. Kept asking about papers and maps, whether anything had been recovered from the water." This detail struck Eli as significant. If Samuel Blackwood had been primarily concerned about incriminating evidence rather than a missing neighbor, it suggested guilty knowledge of what Thomas had been investigating. "Did they find any of his equipment that morning?" "Nothing," Pete replied. Which was strange, because Thomas never went anywhere without his surveying case. But the creek was running high and fast. We figured everything had been swept downstream. Eli thought about the surveying chest he'd found in the flooded cabin, carefully hidden and preserved for 30 years. His father had been more cunning than his killers realized, ensuring that the evidence would survive even if he didn't. Pete, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If I could prove that the Blackwoods killed my father, and if I could complete his irrigation project, would the community support it? Pete's eyes sharpened with interest. You're talking about taking on one of the most powerful families in the territory. The current generation, Samuel's sons Marcus and Robert, they're even more ruthless than their father was. They've expanded their holdings, bought up most of the failed farms from that period. They control more land and water than anyone else in the region. That doesn't answer my question. Pete was quiet for a long moment, studying the irrigation plans with new intensity. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of frustration and suppressed anger. Eli, there are a dozen families in this valley who lost everything because of Blackwood greed. Some moved away, some took jobs working for the very people who destroyed them. But a few of us stayed, and we've never forgotten. If you could prove what your father discovered, and if you could make his irrigation system work, you'd have allies, even knowing the risks. Especially knowing the risks, Pete said firmly. We're old men now, most of us. What do we have to lose? But our children and grandchildren, they deserve better than watching their crops fail while the Blackwoods get richer. Eli carefully rolled up the irrigation plans, feeling the weight of inherited responsibility settling more heavily on his shoulders. His father's vision was bigger than he'd initially realized, not just exposing past crimes, but building a better future for the entire community. There's something else. Pete, the compass in Father's surveying kit, it's been modified to point towards something specific, something northeast of here. I think he hid additional evidence, maybe the complete engineering specifications or legal documentation that would prove everything. Pete nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like Thomas. He was always thorough, always prepared for the worst. If he hid something important, it would be somewhere secure but accessible to someone who knew where to look. I'm going to follow the compass tomorrow, see where it leads. But I wanted to talk to you first, to understand what I might be walking into. Pete stood and moved to the window that looked out over his small farm. In the distance, the sprawling Blackwood Ranch stretched across some of the richest grazing land in the territory. You're walking into a fight that's been waiting 30 years to be finished, he said quietly. Your father started something important, Eli. Maybe it's time to see it through to the end. As Eli prepared to leave, Pete caught his arm. One more thing, be careful who you trust. The Blackwoods have money and influence, and they've had 3 decades to build alliances and buy loyalty. Some folks in town might not be happy to see old secrets dug up. Eli nodded, understanding the warning. The investigation he was undertaking would inevitably threaten people who had profited from his father's death, and desperate people were capable of desperate acts. But as he rode back toward his mountain cabin with Jasper padding alongside, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. His father's irrigation plans represented more than engineering innovation. They embodied a vision of community cooperation and shared prosperity that the Blackwood family had killed to prevent. Tomorrow, he would follow the compass and discover what other secrets Thomas Rourke had preserved for his son. Tonight, he would prepare for a confrontation that had been building for 30 years, one that would determine whether justice could still triumph over greed and murder. The compass led Eli northeast through terrain that grew increasingly rugged as he climbed toward the high country. Jasper moved with cautious alertness, his senses attuned to the subtle wrongness that seemed to permeate this particular stretch of wilderness. They had been following the needle's steady pull for 3 hours when Eli noticed the first signs that others had passed this way recently. Broken branches at horse height, hoofprints in soft earth that the morning frost hadn't yet obscured. Someone else was interested in whatever lay hidden in these mountains. Eli dismounted and examined the tracks more carefully. 2 horses, shod and well-maintained, carrying riders who knew the country well enough to choose the most efficient route through difficult terrain. The tracks were no more than a day old, which meant he wasn't the only one following his father's trail. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured to Jasper, who had begun to growl softly at scents the wind carried from somewhere ahead. The dog's instincts were usually reliable, and his agitation suggested that whatever they were approaching held more than just old secrets. The compass needle pointed toward a natural formation of red sandstone that rose like a cathedral spire from the surrounding pine forest. As they drew closer, Eli could see caves and crevices in the rock face, perfect hiding places for someone who needed to preserve important documents away from prying eyes. But it was the fresh excavation at the base of the formation that made his blood run cold. Someone had been digging here recently, and they had been in a hurry. Earth and stones were scattered carelessly around a hole that had been carved into the soft ground beneath an overhanging ledge. Tools lay abandoned nearby, a pickaxe, shovels, and a pry bar that gleamed with recent use. Eli approached the excavation cautiously, his hand resting on the rifle in his saddle scabbard. The hole was roughly 4 feet deep and twice as wide, clearly excavated by someone searching for something specific. At the bottom, partially buried in loose soil, he found the shattered remains of what had once been a wooden strongbox. His heart sank as he climbed down into the hole and began sifting through the debris. The box had been broken open with considerable violence, its iron reinforcements bent and twisted by whoever had forced it open. Scattered around the wreckage were fragments of paper and leather, most too damaged to read, but clearly the remains of documents that had once been carefully preserved. But not everything had been destroyed. Working methodically through the rubble, Eli found several items that the hasty thieves had overlooked. A small leather portfolio had been wedged beneath a piece of the broken strongbox, protecting its contents from both the elements and the vandals. Inside, he discovered what appeared to be correspondence between his father and territorial officials, along with witness statements from farmers who had documented illegal water diversions. More significant was the object he found wrapped in oiled cloth at the very bottom of the hole, a blood-stained hammer bearing his father's initials. The tool showed clear signs of recent disturbance, as if it had been buried for decades and only recently uncovered. Dark stains on the metal head told a story that made Eli's hands tremble with suppressed rage. This wasn't just evidence of Thomas Rourke's murder. It was likely the weapon that had killed him. Looking for something specific? The voice came from behind him, calm and assured. Eli turned slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle to find 2 men on horseback watching him from the edge of the clearing. Both were well-dressed in the manner of successful ranchers, their horses and equipment expensive and well-maintained. The elder of the 2, a man in his 50s with graying temples and cold eyes, bore a strong resemblance to old Samuel Blackwood. "Marcus Blackwood," Eli said, recognizing the man from his occasional appearances in town. "Interesting place for a morning ride." Marcus smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "My thoughts exactly, Rourke. Funny how you managed to find your way to such a remote location, almost like you knew exactly where to look." The younger man, Robert Blackwood, Eli assumed, had positioned his horse to block the most direct route back toward town. Both men carried rifles in their saddle scabbards, and their posture suggested they were comfortable using them. "Beautiful country up here," Eli replied, keeping his voice steady despite the tension that crackled in the air. "My father used to bring me hunting in these mountains when I was a boy. Taught me to read the land, follow the natural signs." "Your father was a curious man," Marcus said, dismounting with deliberate slowness. "Too curious for his own good, as it turned out. We heard you'd taken an interest in his old haunts. Thought we might ride up and see what all the excitement was about." Eli climbed out of the excavated hole, the blood-stained hammer still in his hand. "Looks like someone beat me to it. Any idea who might have been digging around up here?" Robert laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Could have been anyone. Treasure hunters, maybe. People hear stories about hidden gold and lost fortunes, and they get all kinds of foolish ideas. This wasn't treasure hunting, Eli said, holding up the broken remnants of the strongbox. This was someone looking for specific documents. Someone who knew exactly what they were after and where to find it. Marcus studied the broken box with apparent interest. Shame, really. Historical artifacts should be preserved, not destroyed by careless vandals. I hope nothing important was lost. The casual tone of the conversation couldn't disguise the underlying threat. Both Blackwood brothers were watching Eli's hands, noting every movement and gesture. They had come here for a reason, and it wasn't casual curiosity about historical excavations. "Tell me, Rourke," Marcus continued, "what exactly brought you up here today? Surely not just nostalgia for your father's old surveying trips." Eli weighed his options carefully. He was outnumbered and isolated, miles from the nearest help. But he was also armed, and had Jasper, who had positioned himself strategically near the horses in case a distraction became necessary. More importantly, he now held evidence that could potentially prove the Blackwood family's guilt, if he could survive long enough to present it. "Found some interesting items in an old cabin down in the valley," Eli said, deciding on partial truth. "Father's surveying equipment, mostly. One piece seemed to be pointing in this direction, so I thought I'd take a look." "Surveying equipment," Robert mused. "Funny how the past keeps reaching out to complicate the present. Some things are better left buried, don't you think?" "Depends on what's buried," Eli replied. "Truth has a way of surfacing eventually, regardless of how deep people try to bury it. The confrontation might have escalated then, but Jasper's sudden bark of warning interrupted the tense conversation. All three men turned to see riders approaching through the trees. 4 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful urgency of a search party. "Expecting company?" Marcus asked, his hand moving toward his rifle. Eli recognized the lead rider and felt relief wash through him. "That's Sheriff Coleman and his deputies. I mentioned to Martha Hendricks that I was riding up into the high country today. She must have asked them to check on me. The arrival of law enforcement changed the dynamic immediately. Whatever the Blackwood brothers had planned for this encounter, they couldn't proceed with witnesses present." Marcus remounted his horse with obvious reluctance. "Good to see you're safe, Rourke," he said, his tone now artificially cordial. "These mountains can be dangerous for a man traveling alone. Easy to have accidents in country this remote." As the Blackwoods rode away, Sheriff Coleman approached the excavation site with obvious concern. "What happened here, Eli?" "Looks like someone's been doing some serious digging." Eli showed him the broken strongbox and the scattered documents, carefully omitting mention of the blood-stained hammer until he could decide whom to trust. "Found this when I followed one of Father's old survey routes. Looks like treasure hunters got here before me." Sheriff Coleman examined the scene with professional interest. But Eli noticed that his attention seemed more focused on cataloging what remained than on investigating who might have been responsible for the vandalism. After 30 years of unsolved mysteries, it was possible that some of the local authorities had been compromised by Blackwood influence. "I'll file a report about the vandalism," Coleman said finally. "But there's not much we can do without witnesses or suspects. You might want to be more careful about exploring remote areas alone, Eli, like Marcus said. Accidents can happen in country this isolated." The warning was delivered with apparent concern, but Eli heard the underlying message clearly enough. Some investigations were better left unfinished, and some truths were too dangerous to pursue. As the sheriff and his deputies rode back toward town, Eli carefully wrapped the blood-stained hammer in his coat and secured the surviving documents in his saddlebags. The evidence he'd found was fragmentary, but it pointed toward a conspiracy that reached deeper into the community than he'd initially realized. The ride back to his mountain cabin gave him time to think about what he'd learned and what it meant for his investigation. Someone had known about his father's hidden cache and had moved quickly to destroy it once they realized Eli was following the trail. That suggested coordination and planning that went beyond simple opportunism. More troubling was the possibility that local law enforcement might be compromised. Sheriff Coleman's response to the vandalism scene had been perfunctory at best. And his warning about the dangers of solitary exploration had sounded more like a threat than genuine concern for Eli's safety. As darkness fell over the mountains, Eli sat by his fire and studied the blood-stained hammer by lamplight. The tool was definitely his father's. The initials TR were clearly visible on the wooden handle, carved in the same careful script that marked all of Thomas's equipment. But the dark stains on the metal head told a story of violence that made Eli's chest tight with suppressed emotion. This wasn't just evidence of his father's murder. It was the instrument of his death, preserved by chance and recovered 30 years later by the son who had never stopped wondering about the truth. Tomorrow, he would need to decide how to use this terrible knowledge, and whether the pursuit of justice was worth the risks that were becoming increasingly apparent. The compass in his pocket had led him to partial answers, but it had also revealed the scope of the forces arrayed against anyone who threatened the Blackwood family's secrets. The question now was whether Eli had the strength and cunning to complete what his father had started, knowing that the price of failure might be his own life. 3 days of careful excavation in the flooded cabin's foundation revealed what the Blackwood brothers had missed in their hasty destruction. Of the mountain cache, Thomas Rourke had been more cunning than anyone realized, creating multiple hiding places for his most crucial evidence. Working by lamplight in the pre-dawn hours, when curious eyes were less likely to be watching, Eli had methodically explored every crevice and cavity in the cabin's stone foundation. The hidden safe was built into the cabin's corner wall, concealed behind a loose stone that looked identical to those around it. Only someone who knew exactly where to look, or someone with unlimited time to search, would have found it. The safe itself was a marvel of craftsmanship, a steel strongbox with a combination lock that had somehow survived 3 decades of flooding without significant damage. Eli stared at the lock mechanism by lamplight. Jasper curled nearby for warmth in the damp cabin. The combination could be anything: a date, a series of meaningful numbers, or something only Thomas would have known. But as Eli examined the lock more closely, he noticed scratches around certain numbers, wear patterns that suggested frequent use of specific digits. His father's birthday yielded nothing. Neither did the date of Eli's birth or his mother's death. But when Eli tried the date of their family's arrival in Montana Territory, 07-15-22, the tumblers clicked into place with satisfying precision. Inside the safe, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled leather, lay the heart of Thomas Rourke's investigation. Complete legal documents proving Blackwood water theft, signed witness statements from affected farmers, and correspondence with territorial officials that revealed the scope of the corruption. But most damning of all was a detailed confession letter from Samuel Blackwood himself, apparently obtained through means that Thomas hadn't recorded. The letter, dated just days before Thomas's death, was written in Samuel's recognizable handwriting and detailed not only the illegal water diversions, but also the intimidation tactics used against farmers who resisted. The final paragraph made Eli's blood run cold. Rourke has become an intolerable threat to our family's interests. His irrigation scheme would destroy everything we've built here, reduce us to common farmers scrambling for scraps. If he cannot be reasoned with or bought off, then other measures must be considered. Some problems require permanent solutions. Eli read the confession 3 times, each reading confirming what he'd suspected since finding the blood-stained hammer. This wasn't just evidence of financial crimes, it was documented premeditation for murder. But how had Thomas obtained such a damning confession? The letter was clearly authentic, bearing Samuel's distinctive handwriting and personal seal, but it seemed unlikely that he would have written such incriminating evidence voluntarily. Eli studied the document more carefully, noting that the ink seemed slightly different between paragraphs, as if the letter had been written in stages over several days. The answer came when he found Thomas's own notes tucked behind the confession letter. His father had been more than just a surveyor and engineer. He'd been an amateur detective with a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Samuel's pride is his weakness, Thomas had written. Challenged his intelligence and planning abilities during our confrontation. Suggested he was merely a blunt instrument, incapable of the subtle thinking required for long-term strategy. His response was to outline exactly how clever his water theft scheme has been, how carefully he's manipulated territorial officials and intimidated opponents. Recorded everything for future use. Eli smiled grimly as he understood his father's strategy. Thomas had goaded Samuel into confession by questioning his intelligence, then carefully documented every boastful revelation. It was psychological manipulation of the highest order, turning Samuel's arrogance against him. The safe contained other treasures as well, complete engineering specifications for the irrigation system, detailed cost estimates, and letters of support from farmers throughout the valley. Thomas hadn't just been documenting crimes, he'd been building a comprehensive case for transforming the region's water management system. Most intriguingly, Eli found a letter addressed to him specifically, written in his father's careful hand. "My dear son, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have been realized, and the Blackwood family has silenced me before I could complete my work. But death is not the end of justice, only a pause in its progress. You now possess everything needed to expose their crimes and complete the irrigation project that could transform our valley. The choice is yours. You can use this evidence to seek revenge, or you can use it to build something better. I pray you choose the path of construction rather than destruction, though I will understand if the weight of my death demands satisfaction. Trust Martha Hendricks and Pete McCready, but be cautious of others until you know where their loyalties lie. The compass will guide you to one final cache if these documents prove insufficient. Remember that you are not alone in this fight. The truth has a way of gathering allies when it finally emerges into the light. Your loving father, Thomas Rourke." Eli folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his coat, next to the wooden cross that had never left his chest. The weight of inherited responsibility felt heavier now, but also clearer in its purpose. His father had given him not just evidence of crimes, but a choice about how to use that evidence. As dawn broke over the mountain peaks, Eli made his decision. He would expose the Blackwood conspiracy, but he would do it in a way that honored his father's vision of community cooperation rather than personal vengeance. The irrigation project would be his monument to Thomas Rourke's memory, a living testament to the belief that people could work together to build something better than what greed and violence had created. But first, he needed allies he could trust completely. Pete McCready had already proven his loyalty, and Martha Hendricks had been helpful from the beginning. Now Eli needed to identify others who would stand with him when the truth finally came to light, and who could be trusted to help implement his father's irrigation plans despite the certain opposition from the Blackwood family. The ride back to town took him past several of the farms that had been affected by the water theft 30 years earlier. Some had recovered and prospered through other means, but others showed signs of ongoing struggle. At the Henderson place, now run by Sarah Miller, the daughter Pete had mentioned, Eli stopped to water his horse and assess whether this might be another potential ally. Sarah proved to be a woman in her 50s with shrewd eyes and calloused hands that spoke of decades working her own land. When Eli introduced himself and mentioned his father's name, her expression grew thoughtful. "Thomas Rourke," she said slowly. "Haven't heard that name spoken aloud in years, though I think about your father often. He was trying to help us when he died, you know. Had ideas about how we could all share the water more fairly." Eli showed her one of the irrigation plans from his father's collection, watching her face as she studied the engineering drawings. Her understanding of water management was immediately apparent. She grasped the system's potential almost as quickly as Pete had. "This would have changed everything," she breathed. "Still could if someone had the courage to build it. What would it take?" Eli asked. In terms of community support, I mean. How many farmers would need to cooperate to make something like this work? Sarah considered the question seriously. The affected properties from the drought years. That's maybe a dozen families, though some have moved away or sold out. But if you could prove that this system would provide reliable water, even in dry years, I think you'd find support. People remember what it was like to watch their crops fail while the Blackwood spread stayed green. And if it meant confronting the Blackwood family directly, if it required proving that they've been stealing water for decades? Sarah's expression hardened. Then it's about time someone had the backbone to do it. My father lost everything because of their greed, and I've spent 30 years scratching out a living on land that should have been productive. If you've got proof of what they did, and if you've got a plan to fix it, then you'll have my support. As Eli rode away from the Henderson farm, he felt the first stirrings of hope that his father's vision might actually be achievable. The evidence in the hidden safe was damning enough to destroy the Blackwood family's reputation and possibly land them in territorial prison. The irrigation plans were detailed enough to implement with proper community cooperation. But the confrontation ahead would require more than just evidence and engineering diagrams. It would require courage, strategic thinking, and the kind of community solidarity that his father had tried to build in his final months. The Blackwood family had money, influence, and a demonstrated willingness to use violence to protect their interests. Eli touched the wooden cross beneath his shirt and felt the weight of the blood-stained hammer in his saddlebags. His father had died trying to build something better for the community, and now the responsibility for completing that work had passed to his son. The question was whether Eli had the strength and wisdom to succeed where Thomas Rourke had failed, and whether 30 years of injustice could finally be balanced by truth and determination. The compass led Eli to one final cache, hidden in a natural cave formation 3 miles northeast of the main site. As he followed the needle's steady pull through increasingly difficult terrain, Jasper's behavior grew more agitated. The dog seemed to sense something beyond normal wilderness dangers, a spiritual presence that made his hackles rise and his movements cautious. The cave entrance was small and easily missed, concealed behind a curtain of hanging moss and wild grapevines. Only someone following the compass's precise direction would have found it. Inside, the narrow passage opened into a larger chamber where daylight filtered through cracks in the ceiling, illuminating what appeared to be a carefully arranged shrine. Thomas Rourke's final letter lay on a flat stone at the center of the chamber, weighted down by a river rock and surrounded by personal items that Eli recognized from childhood. His father's favorite pipe, a photograph of Eli's mother, and the matched set of surveying tools that Thomas had treasured. Above all, his other possessions, but it was the letter itself that made Eli's hands tremble as he broke the wax seal and unfolded the carefully preserved pages. The date was February 15th, 1845, the day before the storm that supposedly claimed Thomas's life. My beloved son, if you are reading this, then everything has unfolded as I have foreseen it would. The dreams that began visiting me 6 months ago have shown me my fate with increasing clarity, and I have accepted what must come to pass. I am not fleeing from death, Eli. I am preparing for it, and more importantly, I am preparing for what comes after. The dreams that have haunted my sleep are not random visions, but communications from something beyond my understanding. I have been shown your face as a grown man, standing in the flooded cabin, where I will hide the evidence of Blackwood crimes. I've seen you following the compass I will modify for your use, reading the journals I am writing for your eyes alone. Most clearly of all, I have seen you completing the work that I will not live to finish. This is not prophecy, my son. This is promise. The irrigation system that will transform our valley exists not just in my engineering drawings, but in the divine plan that governs all things. My death is not the end of this project, but the beginning of something larger than either of us could accomplish alone. You may wonder why I do not simply flee, why I do not take my evidence to territorial authorities and expose the Blackwood conspiracy before they can silence me. The answer is both simple and impossible to explain, because my death is necessary for your awakening. The boy I'm leaving behind is not yet the man who will transform this valley. That transformation requires the weight of inherited responsibility, the fire of righteous anger, and the wisdom that comes only through loss and redemption. I have seen the man you will become, Eli, and he is magnificent. Strong where I was merely determined, wise where I was only clever, capable of inspiring others in ways that I never could. But that man cannot emerge while I remain to shield you from the world's hardships. My death will forge you into the leader this community needs. The Blackwoods believe they are eliminating a threat, but they are actually fulfilling a purpose larger than their small minds can comprehend. They think murder will solve their problems, but they are actually creating the instrument of their own destruction. You will not merely expose their crimes. My son, you will build something so much better than what they have created, that their greed and violence will be revealed as the petty cruelties they truly are. I know this letter may sound like the ravings of a man driven mad by stress and fear. Perhaps it is. But I also know what I have seen in dreams that feel more real than waking life. I have seen you standing before a crowd of supporters, presenting evidence that will destroy the Blackwood conspiracy. I have seen water flowing through channels that you will build according to my designs. I have seen children playing in green fields that exist because you found the courage to complete what I started. Most importantly, I have seen peace in your eyes, the peace that comes from understanding your true purpose and fulfilling it completely. That peace is what I am working toward now, arranging everything so that you will have what you need when the time comes to act. The compass will guide you to all the evidence I have gathered, but more than that, it will guide you to the allies you will need. Trust Martha Hendricks completely. She has a role to play in what is coming that she does not yet understand herself. Pete McCready will be your first supporter among the farmers, but others will follow once they see your determination and competence. Sarah Miller carries her father's anger, but also his hope. She will be crucial to building the coalition you will need. Be cautious of Sheriff Coleman, but do not assume he is irredeemably corrupt. Fear makes cowards of good men, and the Blackwood influence has been built on fear as much as greed. When you present overwhelming evidence of their crimes, you may find that some apparent allies become enemies, and some apparent enemies become allies. I cannot see all the details of how events will unfold, only that they will unfold according to a plan that serves justice and the greater good. Trust in that plan, my son, even when the way forward seems impossible. Trust in your own strength, even when you feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of what you are undertaking. Trust in the community that will rally around you, even when they seem too frightened or scattered to be effective. One final gift I leave you, the knowledge that you are not alone in this fight. The same power that has shown me these visions will guide you when guidance is needed most. Listen for it in the wind through the pines, in the sound of water moving over stone, in the silence between heartbeats when you are facing your greatest challenges. The answers you need will come, though not always in the form you expect. Build the irrigation system, Eli. Expose the Blackwood crimes. Transform this valley into the place of cooperation and prosperity that it was always meant to be. But remember that your true victory will not be measured in their defeat, but in what grows from the soil of their destruction. I love you more than words can express, and I am proud of the man you will become. When you stand in the courtroom presenting evidence of murder and theft, when you break ground on the first irrigation channel, when you see the first crops flourishing with reliable water, remember that I am there with you, in the wind and the water and the wild places that shaped us both, your father always. Thomas Rourke Postscriptum. The wooden cross you wear contains more than sentiment. When the time comes for your greatest test, press the center where the arms intersect. You will understand its purpose when understanding is needed most. Eli read the letter twice, his worldview shifting with each revelation. The dreams that had led him to the flooded cabin hadn't been random psychological events. They had been part of a larger design that his father had somehow foreseen. The compass modifications, the hidden caches, even the timing of his investigation, all of it had been orchestrated by a man who knew he was going to die, but refused to let death defeat his purpose. With trembling fingers, Eli examined the wooden cross he had worn for 30 years. In the cave's filtered light, he could see what he had never noticed before. The center joint was slightly different from the rest, designed to be pressed rather than simply worn. When he applied pressure, the center section clicked inward, revealing a hidden compartment that contained a tiny key. The key fit a small lockbox that he found nestled among his father's other possessions in the cave. Inside lay documents that exceeded even his highest expectations. Complete territorial water rights records going back to the founding of Montana Territory, proving definitively that the Blackwood family had never held legal claim to the water they had been stealing. Official correspondence with federal authorities outlining a planned investigation into territorial corruption that had been delayed by Thomas's death. And most stunning of all, a federal arrest warrant for Samuel Blackwood, signed but never served because the primary witness had died before the case could proceed. But beyond the legal documents, the lockbox contained something even more precious: detailed construction plans for the irrigation system that went far beyond anything Eli had found previously. These weren't just engineering drawings, they were complete implementation guides showing exactly how to organize community labor, how to finance the project through cooperative investment, and how to manage the completed system for maximum benefit to all participants. His father hadn't just been designing an irrigation system. He had been designing a new social structure for the valley, one based on cooperation rather than exploitation, shared prosperity rather than concentrated wealth. The Blackwood conspiracy had been just the first target in a much larger transformation of how the community related to its natural resources and to each other. As Eli carefully packed the documents and prepared to leave the cave, he felt the weight of inherited destiny settling onto his shoulders. This wasn't just about exposing crimes or seeking justice for his father's murder. It was about fulfilling a vision that transcended individual revenge and reached towards something approaching the divine. The ride back to his mountain cabin gave him time to process what he had learned and to plan his next moves. The evidence he now possessed was overwhelming, sufficient to destroy the Blackwood family and vindicate his father's work. But the letter had revealed that his true purpose went beyond destruction toward creation, beyond punishment toward transformation. Thomas Rourke had seen his own death coming and had embraced it as necessary for his son's development into the leader the community needed. The man who had entered that cave was still consumed with questions about the past. The man who emerged was focused on building the future his father had envisioned. Tomorrow, Eli would begin the process of gathering allies and presenting evidence that would shake Dry Ridge to its foundations. But tonight, he sat by his fire and contemplated the magnitude of what lay ahead, understanding for the first time that he wasn't just investigating a 30-year-old murder. He was fulfilling a destiny that had been carefully prepared for him by a father whose love had transcended death itself. Jasper lay nearby, finally peaceful now that they had left the spiritually charged atmosphere of the cave. But Eli remained awake long into the night, feeling the presence his father had promised, listening for guidance in the wind through the pines, and finding it in the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat as it aligned itself with purposes larger than personal vengeance or individual justice. The dawn meeting at Pete McCready's farm brought together 12 people who represented the heart of Dry Ridge's farming community. Martha Hendricks had spent 3 days quietly reaching out to families who had been affected by the Blackwood water theft, and the response had been both encouraging and sobering. Some were eager to finally confront the injustices they had endured for 30 years. Others were terrified of the consequences but willing To act if they weren't standing alone, Eli spread his father's complete evidence across Pete's kitchen table as the group gathered around in the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah Miller sat beside Doc Brennan, who had treated the community through the cholera outbreak of 1845, and remembered the suspicious circumstances surrounding Thomas's death. Jim Kowalski, now a grey-haired man in his 40s, represented the children who had grown up watching their families struggle because of Blackwood greed. "Before we begin," Eli said, his voice carrying the weight of inherited authority, "I want everyone to understand what we're walking into. This isn't just about exposing old crimes or getting justice for my father. This is about transforming how this community manages its most precious resource. And that means challenging people who have killed to protect their interests." He showed them Samuel Blackwood's confession letter first, watching faces change as they absorbed the implications of premeditated murder. Then came the territorial water rights documents, proving that the Blackwood family had never held legal claim to the water they'd been diverting. Finally, he presented the federal arrest warrant that had never been served, and the complete irrigation plans that offered an alternative to the current system of scarcity and competition. Sweet Jesus. Doc Brennan breathed, studying the engineering drawings with professional appreciation. "Your father wasn't just documenting crimes, he was designing a solution that would have made the crimes irrelevant." Martha nodded, her fingers tracing the irrigation channels that would have supplied her property with reliable water. "This system could support twice as many farms as we have now and provide surplus for drought years." "What would it take to build?" Sarah asked, her practical nature focused on implementation rather than just evidence. Eli pulled out the construction materials cache that his father's final letter had referenced. Hidden in another cave system, Thomas had stockpiled tools, surveying equipment, and even some of the specialized materials needed for channel construction. It was a treasure trove that spoke to careful planning and absolute commitment to seeing the project through. Father calculated that the basic system could be completed in 2 growing seasons with coordinated community labor, Eli explained. The cost would be significant, but shared among all participating farms, it's manageable. More importantly, the long-term benefits would pay for the initial investment within 5 years. Jim Kowalski leaned back in his chair, processing the magnitude of what was being proposed. "You're talking about taking on the most powerful family in the territory. They've got money, political connections, and a demonstrated willingness to use violence. What makes you think we can succeed where your father failed?" Eli had been expecting this question, and his answer carried the conviction that had been building since reading his father's final letter, because we have something father didn't have when he started his investigation: complete evidence of their crimes, federal backing for prosecution, and most importantly, a detailed plan for what comes after we expose them. Father was building a case against the Blackwoods. "We're building an alternative to everything they represent." The discussion that followed revealed both the potential and the challenges of what lay ahead. Several farm families had been approached by Blackwood representatives in recent weeks, offering to buy their properties at prices that seemed generous until you considered the long-term value of reliable water access. The timing suggested that Marcus and Robert Blackwood had learned enough about Eli's investigation to begin consolidating their position. "They're trying to eliminate potential allies," Martha observed. "Buy up the affected properties so there's no one left to support the irrigation project or testify about past crimes. Which means we need to move quickly," Eli replied, "before they can pressure more families into selling, and before they decide that intimidation isn't working and escalate to more direct methods." Doc Brennan had been studying the federal arrest warrant with particular interest. "This document is signed by Judge Morrison in Helena. If we can get this evidence to him directly, bypass local authorities who might be compromised, we could have federal marshals here within a week." "What about Sheriff Coleman?" Sarah asked. "Do we trust him or not?" Eli considered the question carefully. His father's letter had suggested that Coleman was more frightened than corrupt, but fear could make men do terrible things when they felt trapped. "We prepare for both possibilities," he decided. "We'll approach Coleman with the evidence and give him a chance to do the right thing. But we'll also send copies to federal authorities in Helena. Just in case local law enforcement proves unreliable." The group spent the next hour developing a detailed plan that addressed both immediate security concerns and long-term implementation of the irrigation project. Pete's barn would serve as headquarters for organizing community labor. Martha's store would be the communication hub for coordinating with families throughout the valley. Doc Brennan would handle medical concerns for workers during construction, and also serve as liaison with territorial authorities due to his professional standing in the community. Most importantly, they established a timeline that would allow them to present evidence and begin construction before the Blackwood family could mount an effective counterattack. The approaching spring season worked in their favor. Irrigation construction was best done before the growing season began, and farmers would be available for community labor during the weeks before planting started. As the meeting began to wind down, Eli pulled out the final element of his father's preparations, a detailed map showing the optimal sequence for channel construction, designed to provide immediate benefits to participating farms, while building toward the complete system over 2 years. "We start with the main channel from the proposed reservoir site to the Miller property," he explained, pointing to the route Thomas had marked in red ink. "That gives us the greatest immediate impact and demonstrates the system's potential to skeptical neighbors. Then we branch out to connect other properties as labor and materials become available." Jim Kowalski studied the construction sequence with obvious approval. "Your father thought of everything, didn't he? This isn't just engineering, it's psychology and politics rolled into practical implementation." Father understood that technical solutions mean nothing without community support, Eli agreed. He designed this project to build momentum and create allies as it progressed. As the group prepared to leave, each carrying specific responsibilities for the week ahead, Martha lingered to speak with Eli privately. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "I've been hearing rumors that the Blackwood brothers are planning something big. Hiring men from outside the territory, making preparations that go beyond normal ranch operations." Eli felt a chill of recognition. The pattern was similar to what his father had documented in the weeks before his death, escalating threats that suggested the Blackwoods were preparing for a final confrontation. What kind of preparations? Armed men, extra supplies, and a lot of activity around their property that doesn't look like normal ranching. It could be coincidence, but given what we're planning to reveal, I suspect they're getting ready for a fight. Eli nodded grimly. His father's letter had warned that the path ahead would require courage in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. The Blackwood family had killed once to protect their secrets, and there was no reason to believe they wouldn't kill again if they felt sufficiently threatened. "Then we'd better make sure we're ready for one," he said quietly. "Father sacrificed his life to give us this opportunity. We're not going to waste it." As Eli rode back to his mountain cabin in the pre-dawn darkness, Jasper padding silently alongside, he felt the weight of the coming confrontation settling into his bones. Everything his father had worked for, everything Thomas had died to preserve, would be decided in the next few days. The evidence was overwhelming, the community support was solid, and the federal authorities would almost certainly intervene. Once they saw the documentation of murder and water theft, but between evidence and justice lay a gauntlet of desperate men who had built their power on violence and intimidation. The Blackwood brothers had inherited more than land and water rights from their father. They had inherited his willingness to destroy anyone who threatened their dominance. Eli touched the wooden cross beneath his shirt and felt the presence his father had promised. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. The community was finally ready to stand together. The truth was finally ready to emerge into the light. And somewhere in the wind through the pines, Thomas Rourke's spirit was guiding his son toward the destiny they had both been preparing. For since that terrible night 30 years ago, the confrontation began at dawn on a Tuesday morning when Eli and Doc Brennan rode into Dry Ridge to present their evidence to Sheriff Coleman. They found the sheriff's office empty except for a hastily scrawled note pinned to the door. Called away on territorial business. Back in 1 week. Urgent matters, contact Deputy Marshal in Helena. Convenient timing, Doc Brennan observed grimly. Either Coleman's been warned, or he's decided to make himself scarce until this all blows over. Eli studied the note, recognizing the handwriting, but noting the obvious haste with which it had been written. Doesn't matter. We proceed as planned. They rode directly to Martha's store, where they found her serving an unusually large crowd of customers for so early in the morning. But these weren't ordinary customers. They were the families from yesterday's meeting, along with several others who had heard rumors and come to learn what was happening. Word spreading faster than we expected, Martha murmured to Eli as he entered. Half the valley knows something's stirring. That proved to be both a blessing and a complication. Support for the irrigation project was broader than they had dared hope, but it also meant the Blackwood family would soon learn the full scope of what they were facing. Through the store's front window, Eli could see riders approaching at speed, 3 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful urgency of trouble on its way. Marcus and Robert Blackwood entered the store with a confidence that didn't quite mask their underlying tension. Behind them came a third man Eli didn't recognize, lean and dangerous looking, with the kind of casual violence that marked a professional gunfighter. Morning, folks, Marcus said, his voice carrying false cheer. Beautiful day for community gatherings. Hope everyone's finding what they need. The store fell silent, except for the sound of shifting feet and nervous breathing. Martha moved protectively behind her counter, while Doc Brennan positioned himself near the medical supplies where he kept a pistol for emergencies. Something we can help you with, Marcus? Eli asked, his hand resting casually near his own weapon. Just wondering what's got everyone so excited this morning. Lots of activity for folks who usually mind their own business. Marcus's eyes swept the assembled crowd. Cataloguing faces and no doubt planning retribution for later. Community cooperation, Eli replied evenly. My father believed in it, and it seems like his ideas are finally finding the right audience. Robert stepped forward, his younger face showing less restraint than his brother's. Your father was a troublemaker who died because he couldn't leave well enough alone. You'd be smart to learn from his mistakes. The threat was barely veiled, and several people in the store moved instinctively away from the confrontation. But Eli had been preparing for this moment since reading his father's final letter, and he felt the presence Thomas had promised guiding his words. Funny thing about mistakes, Eli said, reaching into his coat. Sometimes what looks like failure is actually preparation for something bigger. He pulled out Samuel Blackwood's confession letter and held it up for everyone to see. Like this letter your father wrote, detailing his plans to murder Thomas Rourke and steal water from half the families in this valley. The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps echoed through the store as people recognized the implications of what Eli was holding. Marcus's face went white, then flushed red with rage and fear. That's impossible, Robert snarled. Our father never wrote any such thing. Funny, Doc Brennan said, stepping forward with his medical bag. Because I've seen Samuel's handwriting on medical documents for 20 years. This looks exactly like his script to me. Eli continued pulling documents from his coat, water rights records, witness statements, the federal arrest warrant that had never been served. With each revelation, the balance of power in the room shifted further away from the Blackwood brothers. 30 years ago, your father killed mine to protect a criminal conspiracy, Eli said, his voice carrying to every corner of the store. But Thomas Rourke was smarter than any of you realized. He documented everything, preserved all the evidence, and arranged for it to reach the right people at the right time. Marcus had regained some of his composure, but his hand now rested openly on his gun. Even if those papers are genuine, which I doubt, they don't prove anything about current operations. Our family's water rights are legal and properly documented. With forged territorial records and intimidated officials, Martha interjected, stepping out from behind her counter with a rifle in her hands. I've been keeping my own records for 30 years, Marcus. Water usage, crop yields, and which farms failed when your family decided they needed more than their legal share. The professional gunfighter behind the Blackwood brothers had been silent throughout the exchange. But now he spoke in a voice devoid of emotion. This is getting complicated, boss. Maybe we should take this conversation somewhere more private. But before anyone could move, the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed filled the air outside. Through the store windows, Eli could see riders wearing federal marshals badges, along with several men he recognized as territorial officials from Helena. Looks like our conversation just got more interesting, Eli said with grim satisfaction. Those are federal marshals with arrest warrants for water theft, murder, and conspiracy to defraud the territorial government. Marcus's composure finally cracked completely. You son of a bitch. You think you've won something here? You have no idea what you've started. I know exactly what I've started, Eli replied. The same thing my father started 30 years ago. Justice for this. Community and an end to your family's stranglehold on resources that belong to everyone. The store's front door opened to admit Marshal Davidson, a stern man in his 50s who had ridden hard from Helena after receiving Doc Brennan's urgent message. Behind him came 3 deputy marshals and Territorial Judge Morrison himself, a sign of how seriously federal authorities were taking the evidence Eli had provided. Marcus Blackwood, Robert Blackwood, Marshal Davidson announced formally, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, theft of territorial water rights, and fraud in government land dealings. You have the right to face your accusers in territorial court. The professional gunfighter's hand moved toward his weapon, but he found himself facing not just the federal marshals, but half a dozen local men who had drawn their own guns in support of the law. The mathematics of the situation were clear. Resistance would mean a bloodbath that even professional killers couldn't win. This isn't over, Marcus snarled as the marshals placed him in shackles. You people have no idea what you're destroying here. Our family built this valley, made it prosperous. Without us, you'll all be scratching in the dirt like the failures you've always been. We'll see about that, Pete McCready said from the back of the store. Seems to me we're about to find out what this valley can become when folks work together instead of fighting over scraps. As the Blackwood brothers were led away, along with their hired gunfighter, the atmosphere in the store shifted from tension to something approaching celebration. But Eli felt no triumph yet. The arrest was just the beginning of what needed to be accomplished. Judge Morrison approached him with obvious respect. Mr. Rourke, the evidence you've provided is extraordinary. Your father's documentation will ensure that justice is finally served. But I understand you have plans that go beyond criminal prosecution. Eli nodded, pulling out the irrigation system plans. My father died trying to build something better for this community. I intend to finish what he started. The judge studied the engineering drawings with obvious admiration. Ambitious project. You'll need territorial approval for water management changes of this scope. We'll have it, Doc Brennan interjected, along with federal support for infrastructure development that serves community needs rather than private monopolies. As the morning sun climbed higher, transforming the store from a place of confrontation into a planning center for community transformation, Eli felt his father's presence more strongly than ever. The evidence had served its purpose, the criminals were in custody, and the real work of building something better was about to begin. But he also knew that the Blackwood family had resources and connections that extended far beyond Marcus and Robert. The fight for water justice was just beginning, and the construction of his father's irrigation system would face challenges that went beyond engineering and into the realm of politics, economics, and human nature itself. 3 days after the arrests, Eli stood at the proposed reservoir site near Widow's Peak, surrounded by more than 40 volunteers who had come to begin construction of his father's irrigation system. The physical work of transformation was about to begin. But first they needed to overcome the final obstacle that the Blackwood conspiracy had left in their path, the original water source, a natural spring that fed into Willow Creek, had been deliberately blocked by the Blackwood family decades earlier. They had used explosives to create a rockfall that diverted the water's natural flow toward their own property, leaving downstream users dependent on whatever trickle managed to seep through the debris. It was an act of environmental vandalism that had been carefully disguised as a natural occurrence. "According to your father's calculations," Pete McCready said, studying the engineering drawings, clearing this blockage would increase water flow to the valley by nearly 60%, enough to support the entire irrigation system even in drought years. Eli examined the rockfall that had choked off the spring for 30 years. The stones were too precisely placed to be natural, and metal fragments visible among the debris confirmed that explosives had been used. His father's notes indicated that Thomas had discovered this evidence during his investigation, but had been killed before he could expose this final proof of Blackwood sabotage. "We'll need to be careful," Doc Brennan observed, noting the precarious balance of rocks that towered above the spring. One wrong move could bring down half the mountainside, but among the volunteers was Jim Kowalski's eldest son, a young man named Michael, who had learned demolition techniques while working on railroad construction in Colorado Territory. He studied the rockfall with professional expertise, noting stress points and load-bearing structures that would determine how to safely remove the artificial blockage. "It's going to take precision work," Michael announced. "Small charges placed exactly right, sequence time to avoid secondary collapses. But it can be done." The group spent the morning carefully preparing the demolition site while Eli rode back to his father's hidden cache to retrieve the specialized equipment Thomas had stockpiled for this exact purpose. Among the tools and supplies, he found everything needed for precision blasting, small charges, fusing materials, and detailed notes about safe demolition techniques that his father had learned during his own surveying work. But it was the final item in the cache that took Eli's breath away, a restored water flow valve, beautifully crafted from brass and iron, bearing an inscription that read, "For the Thomas Rourke Memorial Irrigation System, water is life. Community is strength." His father had commissioned this piece from the finest metalworkers in Helena, intending it to be the symbolic heart of the system he hoped to build. When Eli returned to the worksite, carrying the valve like a sacred relic, the entire group gathered around to examine Thomas's final contribution to their project. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, but more than that, it represented the vision that had sustained their efforts through 30 years of injustice and fear. "This is what we're really building," Martha said softly, her fingers tracing the inscription. "Not just channels and reservoirs, but a community that shares its most precious resources instead of hoarding them." The afternoon was spent in careful preparation for the controlled explosion that would restore the spring's natural flow. Michael placed his charges with mathematical precision, while the rest of the group cleared potential debris zones and established safe viewing positions. The work was methodical and communal, everyone contributing according to their abilities, everyone invested in the outcome. As sunset approached, everything was ready. The fuses were lit in careful sequence, and the group retreated to the predetermined safe distance. For long moments, nothing seemed to happen, except for thin trails of smoke rising from the rock face. Then the mountainside spoke with controlled thunder. The explosions came in carefully timed succession, each charge designed to stress specific weak points in the artificial rockfall. Stones that had blocked the spring for 3 decades shifted, tumbled, and finally gave way to reveal the crystal-clear water that had been trapped behind them for so long. The result was breathtaking. Water burst from the liberated spring with the force of decades of accumulated pressure, creating a cascade that quickly carved a new channel down the mountainside. Within minutes, Willow Creek's flow had doubled, and the sound of rushing water filled the valley like a song of renewal. But the true moment of triumph came when Eli installed his father's commemorative valve at the junction where the restored spring flow would enter the main irrigation channel. As he turned the valve handle for the first time, water began flowing through the system that Thomas Rourke had designed 30 years earlier. The assembled volunteers broke into spontaneous cheering as clear mountain water flowed through channels that many of them had helped dig over the past 3 days. It was more than just successful engineering. It was the physical manifestation of community cooperation, the proof that people working together could accomplish what seemed impossible when they were divided by fear and competition. "Your father would be proud," Doc Brennan said, standing beside Eli as they watched water flow toward farms that had struggled with drought for decades. Eli touched the wooden cross beneath his shirt and felt a presence that was stronger than memory, more real than imagination. "He is proud," Eli replied with quiet certainty. This is what he saw in his dreams, not just water flowing through channels, but people working together to build something better than what came before. As darkness fell and the volunteers began heading back to their homes, carrying news of the successful restoration to the rest of the valley, Eli remained at the valve site with Jasper. The sound of flowing water was hypnotic, a promise of abundance that would transform agriculture throughout the region. But beyond the practical benefits, the completed irrigation system represented something even more valuable: proof that communities could overcome entrenched power and inherited injustice when they found the courage to work together. The Blackwood conspiracy had been built on division and scarcity, on the belief that some people deserved abundance while others struggled with want. Thomas Rourke's irrigation system embodied the opposite philosophy, that shared resources created shared prosperity, that cooperation was stronger than competition, that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied. The water flowing through his father's channels carried more than moisture for crops. It carried hope for a future built on different principles than the past. As Eli finally prepared to return to his mountain cabin, he took one last look at the valve that bore his father's name and the inscription that captured his vision. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the irrigation system expanded to serve more farms and integrate more families into the cooperative network Thomas had envisioned. But tonight, water flowed where it had been blocked for 30 years. And a son had finally completed the work his father had died trying to finish. In the sound of rushing water and the satisfaction of community accomplishment, Eli heard the voice his father had promised would guide him, not supernatural, but deeply natural, arising from the connection between people and land, and the eternal hope that justice could triumph over greed when ordinary folks found extraordinary courage. 6 months later, Eli stood in the doorway of what had once been the flooded cabin, watching morning sunlight stream through windows that now opened onto productive fields instead of standing water. The legal deed in his hand bore the territorial seal and his name as the official owner of the property that had started his journey toward truth and justice. The cabin itself had been transformed through community, effort into something Thomas Rourke would have recognized and approved. The flood damage had been repaired, the foundations strengthened, and the interior converted into a meeting hall for the valley's new water management cooperative. Maps covered the walls, showing not just the completed irrigation system, but plans for expansion that would eventually serve farms throughout the territory. Jasper padded through the restored rooms with the confidence of a dog who knew he was home. At 8 years old, the border collie moved more slowly than he once had, but his eyes remained sharp and his loyalty absolute. He had been with Eli through every stage of the investigation and construction, and now he seemed to understand that their long journey was finally complete. "Hard to believe it's the same place," Martha Hendricks observed, joining Eli in the doorway. At 67, she carried herself with the satisfaction of someone who had lived to see justice triumph over corruption. The general store she had run for 30 years was now the unofficial headquarters for coordinating water distribution throughout the valley. Eli nodded, remembering the murky water and floating debris that had first led him to his father's hidden documents. Sometimes I think this was always what it was meant to become. Father just had to wait for the right time to show me. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the road that wound past the cabin. A small group of riders was making its way toward them. Pete McCready and his son, Sarah Miller, with her youngest daughter, and several other families who had become the core of the irrigation cooperative. They came bearing news from the territorial capital, where the final legal proceedings against the Blackwood conspiracy had concluded just days earlier. "It's finished," Pete announced as he dismounted. Marcus and Robert Blackwood were sentenced to 15 years territorial prison for murder, conspiracy, and water theft. Their ranch has been broken up and sold to pay restitution to affected families. Sarah smiled, with the kind of deep satisfaction that came from seeing decades of injustice finally balanced. "The Henderson farm, my father's old place, I was able to buy it back at a fair price. First time our families owned that land in 30 years, but the most significant news came from Doc Brennan, who had ridden out from town with official documents from the territorial government. The Thomas Rourke Memorial Irrigation System has been designated as a model for water management throughout Montana Territory. Federal engineers are studying your father's designs for implementation in other valleys." Eli accepted the documents with quiet pride, understanding that his father's vision was spreading beyond their small community to influence water policy across the developing West. It was a legacy that transcended personal justice and reached toward systemic change. The group gathered inside the restored cabin for what had become their monthly cooperative meeting. The agenda covered practical matters, maintenance schedules, expansion plans, and resource allocation, but the atmosphere was celebratory. Crop yields throughout the valley had increased by an average of 40% since the irrigation system became operational. No farm had lost crops to drought, and several families had been able to expand their operations significantly. "There's been another development," Martha announced during the meeting. "The territorial legislature is considering a bill that would require all large water users to participate in cooperative management systems. They're calling it the Rourke Water Rights Act." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Thomas Rourke's name would be permanently associated with water justice throughout the territory, ensuring that his principles would guide resource management for generations to come. "Father would have been amazed," Eli said quietly. "He was trying to solve a local problem, and it's become a model for the entire region." "That's how real change happens," Doc Brennan observed. "One community finds the courage to do the right thing, and the example spreads until it becomes the new standard." As the meeting concluded and people began heading back to their farms, Eli walked outside with Martha and Pete to watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The valley spread below them, green and prosperous in ways that would have been impossible under the old system of scarcity and competition. "What's next for you?" Pete asked. "You've accomplished everything your father set out to do and more." Eli considered the question while watching water flow through the channels that now crisscrossed the valley like arteries of abundance. "I've been thinking about that. The cooperative needs permanent leadership, and there are other valleys that could benefit from similar systems. You thinking about expanding?" Martha asked with interest. "Not just expanding, teaching." Father's engineering was brilliant, but the real innovation was the social structure he designed. Teaching communities how to work together, how to share resources instead of fighting over them. That might be the most important work of all. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Eli made his way back to the cabin that would serve as his permanent home. The decision to stay had been gradual but inevitable. His mountain hermitage had served its purpose as a place of healing and reflection, But his true calling lay in community leadership and the ongoing work of building cooperative institutions. Jasper settled by the fireplace with the contentment of a dog who had found his proper place in the world. The cabin that had once symbolized decay and abandonment now represented renewal and hope. The sound of water flowing through nearby channels provided a constant reminder of what could be accomplished when people chose cooperation over conflict. Before retiring for the night, Eli stepped outside one final time to check the commemorative valve that controlled water flow to the main distribution channel. The brass gleamed in the moonlight, and the inscription, "Water is life, community is strength," seemed to glow within a light. As he turned the valve, ensuring optimal flow for the night irrigation cycle, Eli felt his father's presence one last time, not as a spiritual visitation, but as a living influence woven into the fabric of the community Thomas had died trying to create. Every farm that flourished, every family that prospered, every cooperative decision that prioritized shared benefit over individual gain carried forward the vision that had sustained Thomas Rourke through his final, dangerous months. The investigation that had begun with a water-stained document was complete. The irrigation system that had existed only in engineering drawings was functioning beyond all expectations. The community that had been divided by fear and scarcity was now united by abundance and mutual support. Most importantly, the legacy of Thomas Rourke lived on not just in memorials and legislation, but in the daily choices of people who had learned that justice and prosperity were not zero-sum games, that building something better for everyone was always possible when ordinary folks found extraordinary courage. As Eli finally headed inside, followed by Jasper, he carried with him the deep satisfaction of a son who had honored his father's memory, not through vengeance, but through construction. The flooded cabin had become a symbol of renewal. The hidden evidence had served its purpose, and the mountain man who had once lived in solitude had discovered his true calling as a builder of communities, in the gentle sound of water flowing through channels that would serve the valley for generations to come. Thomas Rourke's voice whispered its final message, that love transcends death, that justice delayed is not always justice denied, and that the greatest monuments are built not of stone, but of the cooperative efforts of people working together towards shared prosperity and mutual respect.